Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this exciting session. My name is Joachim Junghans, and it's my pleasure to welcome you as Artistic Director of Conservatorium Maastricht, a partner of the MCICM. Don't worry, this session is non-moderated. I just want to send a very short signal from Conservatorium Maastricht and as part of the MCICM. Becoming a classical musician of the future is a key topic for us. Our institution is dedicated to being international, to foster community, and to innovate. And this, above all, is really important to us. We are proud to be part of the MCICM, and I want to emphasize the relevance of this session for us. And this is why I give the floor now to the wonderful colleagues of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that lovely welcome. I have the unenviable task of doing the mumbling while sharing my screen. So I'm just going to do that, and then we'll get started. Okay, thank you for the thumbs up, Tom, which I saw just before the rest of my view was blocked out. So it's lovely to be here. It's a shame not to be in Maastricht, which was a wonderful experience when we were here 2 years ago. But as I'll explain, our meeting during that symposium 2 years ago has led to the project that we're going to talk about today. And the conference theme this time of classical music of the future has led us to think about the implications of that potential change in the industry for performers and their attitudes to innovation. So the four of us presenting today have met in various ways. Adam and I met over some excellent Dutch apple cake just down the road from the conference venue last time we were in Maastricht, and started talking about the connections between the practical work that Adam does with Manchester Collective and the audience research that Karen and I have been doing over a number of years with audience events and festivals in venues around the UK. Through our shared thinking, we launched a bid for a funded doctoral research project, which Tom is now undertaking with our team of 4. And so this year's conference has been our first chance to really do some data collection together and to start thinking about the shared research that we might do over the next few years. So our research questions for today are around the training that classical musicians have undergone in their education and throughout their careers, and how this has prepared them for their current roles and for their adaptability to change in the future. We wanted to know how those musicians could best be supported at various stages in their careers, both in their training and once they're in post. And so today we're going to present some very preliminary findings from a survey of orchestral players. We're going to use those findings to inform a discussion about the role of player perspectives in shaping classical music of the future, balancing the emphasis on audiences, which Karen and I have observed in most of the research relating to this topic. So this session is going to be organised in 2 halves. In the first half, Karen, Tom and I will present those preliminary findings, and in the second half, Adam and Tom will have a discussion together about the practical implications of what we found, and then open the floor for others in the audience to share their ideas and perspectives. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, great. So yeah, I just thought I'd start with some kind of context and positioning, I guess, really. So coming from our perspectives as audience researchers, of course, we think about the performer, but generally the researchers tended to focus on the audience perspective of the performer, thinking about the ways in which concerts might be presented to better engage audiences, to help them have different insights into the music, what creates a really kind of engaging and meaningful experience. So a lot of the researchers explored the strategies that can be used to do these things. But often that doesn't talk about what it feels like as a performer to have to use these new initiatives to engage with the audience in this different way, which kind of breaks down the barrier of being a traditional classical performer on the stage away from your audience. So trying to break down those barriers and what that feels like when your training has maybe prepared you for something quite different. So these innovative approaches that are often discussed in audience research require new skills of performance of the performers. And so it makes sense that we should ask performers about how it feels to be involved in these kinds of activities, and what they feel comfortable with, what they feel prepared for, and what value perhaps they feel it offers them in terms of their musical performance, but in terms of their connection with their audiences as well. The risk of these kinds of strategies and interventions perhaps is that there's potential for this change in direction for classical music to leave some players behind. Some people may not feel very comfortable about it at all. Some may not see the relevance of it. Some may feel that they need some extra support but don't know where to find it. So there's a kind of need for us to understand this whole piece a little better. And I think that the last year has really emphasised how engaging with audiences has changed and how that's likely to continue to be to work slightly differently. So there's a need for us to understand a little bit more about the training that might be required to equip players for this future of the classical music industry, whether that's about agility, about resilience, about a different kind of mindset, but it's about understanding how we can support musicians and performers to respond to the changing industry. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
So we have done, as Stephanie said, this is our first opportunity to gather data together. So during the past few months, we have been running a pilot study. And obviously, we're aware that we've been doing this in pandemic conditions, where the last year for musicians has been a very different one to normal. So we tried to ask our participants about typical experiences in the industry, as well as experiences during the pandemic. And we're going to reflect on some of that data as we go through the presentation today. So there were two parts to this. We did an online survey, which asked musicians to talk about their careers, about their kind of career journeys, the training that they'd had, the kinds of work that they do and their preparedness for that work, and their reflections on what skills they need now and they think that musicians are going to need in the future. So a really kind of broad-ranging survey which talks about history as a performer, as well as reflecting into the kind of now and the future. So for that survey, we received 26 responses from 2 ensembles. And then Tom has been doing some interviews with some of those, with some of the players from the ensembles. We've done some of these, but we've not yet completed that work. So we're mostly reflecting today on the questionnaire data, but there are some bits and pieces in there from the interviews as well. Next slide, please. So this is just a brief slide, really, just to show you the kinds of training that our participants had received. And you can see here that the majority of our participants had received a very traditional training in university or conservatoire at both undergraduate and postgraduate level, with a smaller number of people identifying other opportunities that they'd had, like taking part in national youth orchestras or European community youth orchestras, the IADJF, I couldn't fit it all on the slide, so that's the International Artist Diploma and Junior Fellowship, so one person had done that. So a range of experiences, but primarily university and conservatoire education. And some people, lucky or old enough to have received some free tuition in schools, but majority kind of privately funded by parents and things for their education. Next slide, please. So we asked the participants to reflect on their kind of their career pathways. So tell us how what the shape of your career has been, kind of thing. And there was a kind of mixed portrayal of the pathways through. For some, it was a pretty linear process where it was a case of building a portfolio of experience during conservatoire, getting on extras lists, and then eventually making their way into a permanent position within an orchestra. For others, it was a bit more of a wiggly line. It was a bit more wobbly, where they sort of built up a portfolio of experiences doing different kinds of things as a freelance freelance musician, but always with the intention of finding that kind of permanent post with an orchestra. So kind of, yeah, using that range of experience to kind of help make that case. And then for others, it was a much broader kind of path, range of experiences, which weren't necessarily purposeful with a view to getting a seat in an orchestra, but ended up there anyway. And with those people in particular, reflecting on the value of those diverse experiences on their being able to acquire that seat in the orchestra. So this final quote in green here: my diverse experience, such as chamber musician, modern ensemble player, soloist, orchestral musician, helped me. And that was quite common amongst that group that had that much kind of more flexible kind of route through beyond conservatoire or their training. So the notion of the skills gained through wider experiences was not common across the data, but was certainly flexible, was certainly present for those that had experienced that route. Next slide, please. So the need for flexibility was very evident in the narratives across the data. Some who had a general ambition to pursue a music career talked about following advice offered by teachers and mentors and taking opportunities that were there. So not necessarily kind of seeking things out, but just following advice, taking opportunities and kind of finding their career in that way. So that's kind of reflected by this first quote here. But there's a certain serendipity and luck that also emerged through the data. The sense of kind of wanting to make the most of things that they hadn't necessarily expected, of just being open-minded to things that were coming along, the sense of wanting to adapt to new opportunities, to flex their skills so that they could meet the demands of things that they hadn't necessarily expected. And the need of overcoming or thriving, I would say, actually, to challenge. And there's a thread that's going to come back later in the slides that this is not necessarily an easy industry, and that it's quite difficult sometimes to be a professional musician. But there's something here about the challenge that leads to enjoyment. There's something pervasive about the industry and a musician's passion for the industry that kind of helps them keep enjoying it, helps sustain motivation. I think another key thing that I just wanted to point out here was about this need for lifelong learning, and the idea that as a professional musician, you don't just stop learning when you graduate, and that actually you start to learn when you graduate, and it's about constantly learning, constantly adapting, but also working out a route that suits you. So a route that plays to your own values, your own interests, and that feels comfortable. Next slide, please. Oh, cheers.
That's okay. So this theme of agility that Karen's just been referring to was obviously highlighted in Microcosm when we asked people to think about their work in the last year during the pandemic and the lockdowns that have happened around the world. And the way in which people talked about this, I think, was quite revealing of that adaptability, flexibility that seems to be important to being ready for change in your industry. So some players talked about the last year only in terms of loss, which is perfectly understandable, but the only things they mentioned were the things that they had not been able to do. So the live performance, the connection with an audience, the international travel. And so there was a sense entirely of what they valued about their work being taken away from them. Some others talked much more about new work opportunities. So that sense of loss was still there, but they had used that time to write more, to take on new pupils. They'd learnt a lot more about online teaching, done some coaching and so on. And then there were 5 comments, perhaps indicative of a bigger theme that will come out through the interviews, on self-care and the recognition that this was an opportunity, albeit not a very welcome one, for increased relaxation, time with family, opportunity for practice off the treadmill of the usual kind of pace of rehearsals and so on. So they had spent their time cooking, drinking wine and gardening, like all the rest of us. So there was a range of attitudes to loss and to change, obviously with many confounding. People will have had different kinds of lockdown according to their family circumstances, whether they became ill, whether they lost family members and so on. So this isn't reliable data about what it is like to be an orchestral musician in a pandemic, but it's another indicator of the kind of agility that seems important to cultivate in the industry. We asked a broad question: what do you enjoy most about your work? And you can see from the word cloud of the responses here, playing great music is the kind of key thing that comes out. There is mention of audiences, but a lot of the terms are within the playing organisation, within the orchestra. So the quote on the left is an example: I love working with people to create something powerful in that one moment, putting together programs that have a gripping emotional arc, giving everything to get as much of that across in performance. It's about making the art come alive. So it's very much about the portrayal of great music with performers. Again, a reminder to audience researchers that the perspective of the players, which is often missing in that research, is quite different potentially. It is part of a kind of work environment. It's a kind of shared endeavour, and the communication to the audience is only the very last part of that process. So playing great music is the priority, but as Karen alluded to earlier, this comes at a cost to the players. And there were lots of responses that referenced the exhaustion of being an orchestral musician, the difficulty of achieving a work-life balance, the fear of mistakes, a sense of pressure, the feeling that you have worked hard for your job, but it's always slightly at risk. And there was a tone in some of the responses that this was just an inevitable part of the job, almost something that had to be and coped with. This person talking about working for a month or longer without a day off, working unsociable hours, lots of traveling, but because I absolutely love my job, I don't necessarily see these challenges in a negative light. And another quote on the left there illustrating the same sorts of things, how hard it is to have a normal life, to balance being a classical performing musician with other aspects of life, although again, often tiring and stressful, though also often exhilarating. So those two things come together as if they are a necessary binary experience within the profession. So Tom, over to you.
How's my sound? Can you hear me?
Perfect, thank you.
Amazing. So within the survey, we also asked the respondents whether they'd been engaged in work that they hadn't previously trained for, and if so, how regularly or how often. You can see here there's around 27% that say they do so often. There's around 40% which say they do so sometimes, and then 27% rarely. There's also 4%, which is one person who says they never do work that they've not trained for, but that was actually one of our interview participants, and we dug down a bit deeper with that and found that they've actually engaged in quite a lot of training that's self-motivated around well-being, Alexander technique, and individual leadership courses. And then even within that, there were still things that came up for them that they hadn't trained for, such as being on a board and other elements of leadership. Next slide, please. So respondents were also asked to expand on their answers to that previous question. And you can see some examples here. Out of the 25 that responded here, 8 of them mentioned work in education, community or outreach environments. There were 5 that mentioned theatrical elements of performance, which included acting, dance and movement outside of what's required within playing an instrument. 4 mentioned improvisation, and there were also, I think, around 4 that mentioned personnel management. And that included things such as organising rehearsals and keeping on top of the players within your section, but also dealing with some difficult conversations and kind of human resources elements, which they actually spoke quite evocatively about, saying that they'd learned from the pain of their mistakes that went along with those areas. There were other things that were mentioned, including public speaking, programming, and there are a few references to recording as well. So these things generally go beyond the technical precision that's required of an instrumental player, and that many people focused on within their responses about conservatoire training. For me, I found this quite interesting because I think it takes it beyond, for anyone that's read Anna Ball's Class Control Classical Music 2019, it moves it away from a potentially gendered, classed or racialized and generally restrained environment that classical musicians can feel themselves working within and trained for. So that change or development is then only open to those people that choose to do that kind of work. And there's the quote here, "I don't often agree to work which I feel I haven't trained for, so I don't get asked for it." And I think the fact that that work is optional is quite interesting to me as a project manager as well as a researcher, as it will start to determine who's fixed for certain work or who's programmed, and ultimately how their skills develop and their practice develops. So I wonder if there's a bit more research there about that gap that Karen mentioned at the start between those that do and those that don't. Next slide, please. We found some interesting responses about how people perceive the industry to have changed. And that went all the way through from, nope, nothing has changed, nothing at all, through to people giving quite specific answers, generally related to equity, equality, diversity, inclusion, that kind of world. So some of them spoke about there being more women in the industry now than when they joined. And that goes across within particular sections of the orchestra, conductors being invited, all the work being programmed in performance. And others spoke about louder voices calling for change in terms of diversity. But that didn't always manifest in more action about diversity. It was generally still kind of lobbying rather than the actual doing. The quote in green here, disappointingly, racial diversity is still very low, but organizations are starting to understand the importance of their role for change rather than always just passing the buck to education. Suggests to me that they are aware of this world of equity, diversity, inclusion being a journey and kind of something that they continue to learn about and engage in, but the enactors of change here, or those that are potentially slowing the process, is the organization rather than the musicians within them. So I also wondered here how my own position influenced these responses, that many of the people within my ensemble know me as an equality and diversity person, and perhaps there was a bit of confirmation bias that came through here in terms of them responding with particularly equality, diversity, inclusion responses. The final point on this one is that there was a general recurring theme of musicians being asked to do more for less. And that was both pre-pandemic in terms of a higher quantity of work for what was essentially less money, but also the changing requirements of musicians now that they're dealing with cameras and close filming and all of the work that goes alongside that. Next slide, please. This is not me, is it?
No, it's me.
Great, go.
So we asked a question on the survey, which said, knowing what you know now, would you still train as a classical musician? And actually, 80, oh, have I skipped a slide? Oh, I have. Oh,
yeah, Tom had a little bit more.
Oh, sorry.
I think you've covered a fair bit of this, but
sorry.
Yeah. That's all right, don't worry. So yeah, only 4 respondents stated that they'd received specific training. Some were very dismissive of the need for training, stating that it's a common sense thing and everyone should find their own way. In preparation for this presentation, Karen and Stephanie were talking about how this shows that the respondents are identifying for themselves how to develop these new skills, which could be a really positive thing, but also questioned how many of them are put off. So those that just say no to that work, and potentially them saying no to that work because additional skills are required. Stephanie then added to that, saying that the common sense approach risked perpetuating the status quo and slowing the rate of change, which, as someone that works within one of these organizations, is something that rings true. The comment of "this is the way we've always done things" is a phrase that I come up against quite a lot, and it's quite a difficult journey to bring people along that path with us, and particularly those that choose not to engage in the work that they haven't trained for. On to you, Karen.
Sorry about that. So yeah, we asked people that, knowing what they know now, would they still train as a classical musician? And 81% of them said they would still train to be a classical musician, which I think is really kind of encouraging, particularly that is coming on the back of a year of global pandemic. So several of our participants acknowledged that they a sense of privilege, that they'd had an easy route into the industry, recognising the benefit of either free lessons that they'd received through school education or through having parents who were able to afford to pay for them to have a private private tuition and things like that. And also those that had managed to achieve a secure position. If you're lucky enough to have a secure position, it's an incredible life, So definitely recognition that this is a privilege. And there's a sense that there are really high levels of job satisfaction that are caused by positive aspects of the work, which help sustain through challenges, as we've already kind of mentioned. And I do partly wonder whether the diverse paths and opportunities associated with the performance profession are also part of this kind of the appeal of a performance industry, and I wonder if that helps keep the work feeling fresh and motivating, and maybe led another of the participants to say those unforgettable performance moments are worth the hard graft. And so there's something there about the absolute highs really balancing out some of the challenges and the hard work involved. And there are definitely stories in the data of people identifying repertoires and kind of combinations of performances that they really still haven't had a chance to do in their careers so far, and really looking forward to having opportunities to take in their future working lives. So, a really positive message coming out. But that's not to say that there aren't kind of acknowledged difficulties, which we've kind of already touched on. These include things like financial challenge, needing to know a lot of extra stuff, like how to organise taxes, how to deal with the business side of the industry, and how to deal with change, actually, particularly if you're someone who finds that quite difficult. So I think that there's some things here saying I couldn't think of anything else I would like to do for a living. And if I studied now, I would be trained for things that are more relevant to modern classical musicians. So an acknowledgement or a presumption, perhaps, that training has changed over time. So a general sense of satisfaction, an expectation that musicians now are being prepared for the new type of working life, but also some people who are perhaps have experienced a particular position for a long while and are feeling frustrated by certain aspects of the career. They don't go into too much detail, the person that said that, but I think maybe some of the things that other people are able to override, like the kind of, working hours or, the financial constraints, maybe become tiresome over time. I don't know, there wasn't any more detail about that. So that might come out in the interviews, I hope. And then we asked people to follow up on that and kind of say or recommend changes that might need to be encompassed in training. And these tended to focus on people skills, some people asking for leadership training, networking skills, those kinds of elements, and strategies for physical and mental well-being. So several references to things like Alexander technique, meditation, and then also things like mentoring or mutual support. So the kind of peer-to-peer support between musicians, and then other comments such as just knowing how to look after your instrument and the kind of practical side of things as well. Next slide, please. Can you move the slide on, Steph?
I think I have.
It's there. Sorry,
that kind of stuff. Go on, Karen.
Sorry, it was a delay, I think.
Okay.
So in terms of skills and training, then these keywords here definitely characterize the data. Things like adaptability, flexibility, self-promotion and networking, and social media is mentioned. Open-mindedness, the ability to take opportunities, to see opportunities and to take them. These are all prevalent in the data. One person in the data says it's difficult to know what to suggest needs to be included in training. And I think because they say it's the job you learn by doing. And I think that's a kind of interesting approach. And it suggests to me that actually there's an element of entrepreneurialism that goes hand in hand with being a musician. So while it is difficult to train musicians for all eventualities of what their professional career might look like, the skills of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurialism are perhaps where institutions could direct their attention, so that musicians can recognise they have the skills and abilities to adapt and flex and change in response to a changing market. And I wondered also, you know, in that spirit of being able to seize opportunities or feel able to do so, you know, whether there's a space for organisations to provide a greater range of opportunities that students might experience failure, you know, have the chance to try things out and fail in a safe environment so that they can see that the world doesn't stop turning and we learn through failure. So I want, you know, it implies some of that kind of stuff through this data as well. There's also a sense that, Steph, can you just go back to the other slide, sorry, about preserving the classical music scene. So there's something there about the individual, but there's also something here about the industry and an individual's role within the sector more generally. So there's a couple of nice quotes here on the screen, but it's, you know, there's mention here of collaborating with a greater range of artists, the need for improvisation skills, educational skills, skills for reaching wider audiences, perhaps online, building networks internationally. You know, all of these things will serve the industry as well as the individual. And I think there's maybe some hints there that this might shape what training could look like in the future. Next slide. So this is a nice quote from just one of our participants when we asked them about what advice would you give, you know, the next generation, if you like. And it sums it up quite nicely. For me, it's important that musicians have opportunities to reflect and understand themselves and their strengths and their values, about how they learn, about how they respond to disappointments and frustrations, and helping musicians to recognise their tools, their flexibility, their versatility. I think that there's a need for an openness, for the need to continue, you know, lifelong learning is a really important feature of anyone's working life, actually, but I think particularly for musicians at the moment as well. And so training perhaps needs to be a space for individually centred, individually personalised processes and skills to have space to percolate, and for students to develop the self-awareness and agency to develop a life in music. So really thinking about who they are, what their values are, and what that might mean for their long-term working lives. Next slide.
So I'm aware of time, so I'll kind of go quite quickly through this one, but I just wanted to reflect on how our language within the survey and the interviews, and also as a sector, for some of our interview participants was actually quite constraining, and they felt quite confined by that language. So we asked within the interviews for musicians to talk about their careers as a classical musician, and quite a few of them actually came back and said, oh, as a classical musician, and gave a very specific response to that question. And when asked if we'd asked about musician in general, what would you have said? And a whole range of other things came out, including like creating their own music in R&B, grime, EDM, all of this kind of world that I think I personally am very interested in. And the same career, work, job, profession, that's something that we used interchangeably throughout the process. And I would like to do a bit more research to see how that affected different responses to different questions within that world. Thanks, Steph.
Thank you, Tom. So that's the end of the presentation of our survey data, interview data. And you'll see it's very preliminary. It's a self-selecting sample of people who have succeeded within the profession and have got their relatively secure orchestral place, and then are willing to answer surveys. So we obviously have a snapshot of a particular sector of the classical music profession here. But within that data, there is a real sense of the ideal of the orchestral player's work. There is still a kind of imagined, idealized role, even if the day-to-day reality doesn't always match up to that ideal. That is the thing that keeps people motivated, that playing of great music with like-minded people. It felt from the data like change and adaptability are acknowledged to be in the hands of the player. It's difficult, I think, and I'm sure about this from their professional perspectives, difficult to impose change on a group of players who have very individualistic perspectives on the work that they do. And it requires that response from the players and that support for them through development and training. Current players definitely seem to learn from their predecessors. and to expect change to happen over time, and therefore not necessarily to affect them. So there is a sense of resistance, even if it's not an active resistance. There can be a sense that change will be slow, or alternatively really radical. Again, Adam and Tom might have things to say about that. But overall, that really strong sense from these players that this is all about learning about music and about yourself. That's the purpose of music. So I think we've got from those survey responses at least the starting point for a discussion. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, I hope, in order to open the floor initially to Adam and Tom to talk from their professional perspectives, and then to others in the room who might have experience from their own playing or managing or research perspectives that we can draw into the discussion. So if anybody has kind of questions for any of us, I think you can put them in the chat, although it looks like we're getting questions from the session that is happening in parallel. So this might become confusing, but let's see what happens. Adam, can I hand over to you next to kind of respond from your Manchester Collective position and move the discussion into more broad areas?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. And regarding the questions, I think there's an arrow to the left next to the chat. So if you select the channel for session 1A, then you can just ask questions and we can reply to comments in the channel for this session rather than the grand mosh pit of the entire conference. So yeah, my name's Adam Sobel. I'm the Chief Executive of Manchester Collective, which is an organisation based in the north of England. I'm not here as a researcher, but rather as a sort of research-minded practitioner, I suppose. And we're working quite closely with Tom on some research when it comes to our players and our audiences, and of course with Stephanie and Karen on the kind of sort of broader picture of that research. So I guess I thought it might be useful to offer a couple of reflections on the research that, you know, we've had at this point and on our practice. Stephanie mentioned the sample size, which I think does bear repeating, that we're, you know, really the people that we were interviewing for this study are at the top of their game. The nature of the group that I run is that we're really working with the very top chamber musicians in the country who are kind of never not busy. And the players in the Philharmonia Orchestra, I guess, have made it through this gauntlet into one of the top symphony orchestras in the world. And so certainly, I think it's fair to say that not all musicians in the UK would agree that the pandemic has been mostly a chance to get to know wines from Burgundy, and but that is by the by. So I think from my perspective, I guess I wanted to offer a couple of reflections on what it is that these musicians might actually be doing in the future, and then to go on to say a little about who those musicians might actually be in the future. I think it may well be that this is a bit of a unique scenario in the United Kingdom, but certainly in the UK, I think public policy priorities are such that orchestras and the classical music sector in general are having to change the sort of parameters of the work that we produce. There's a really big emphasis on relevance, that actually, you know, reaching a broad range of audiences and creating work that engages with local communities in different ways is no longer kind of a fringe or a bolt-on part of the orchestral project, but is one of the core offerings of the work that orchestras and classical organizations are producing in the UK. And I guess what we see as funders and kind of policymakers make these sweeping changes which are linked to funding is that eventually that filters down to the kind of work that the musicians will be asked to do. There's obviously a delay with that. And so I think one of the interesting, I guess, effects of this is that often we see conservatoires training musicians for the work that musicians in the sector were engaging in 4, 5, 6 years ago, rather than the work that they might be asked to do upon graduation. In terms of this kind of relevance question of the work that orchestras are going to have to deliver, I mean, there's a big emphasis on the geographical distribution of the work that we produce, that it's not just centered around heritage concert halls. Emphasis on, I guess, proactively seeking to address the barriers that there are to becoming an artist, and kind of participatory work in local communities, which again is quite different to the kind of work that symphony orchestras have historically engaged in. For us, I think at the collective, we require all of the historical kind of virtuosic technical skills that classical musicians have always had, but that's kind of the starting point. On top of that, there's all of the kind of improvisation, artistic collaboration, digital work, and then also working in and around communities, which I think, I mean, actually, I would sort of push back against the comment that came out in the interviews in that, like, this is a job that you learn by doing. I mean, I think where we have musicians working in really specific community settings, you know, in hospitals or with kind of refugees or with people who have no experience of this world, then it just sort of seems kind of crazy to me, to be honest, that you would throw someone into that environment without having trained them. Yeah, so again, the fact that these reflections are coming from musicians who are established and who have had one kind of training may be influencing the data that we've had. So yeah, so it's clear, I think, that the work that is going to happen in the future in these organizations is going to be very different from work happening in the past. I'm not sure that totally comes out in the research at this point. I guess the second thing that I wanted to bring up, and I'd be really interested to see any questions in this area, like who the body of these musicians are that will be working in our sector in the next kind of 20, 30, 40 years. Certainly for us at the collective, the sample from which we draw our players are typically the top chamber players that are working in the UK. And I think there's a pretty clear sort of problem in that, at least in the UK, I mean, you basically have to come from like an affluent background in order to become a chamber musician, because you have to afford to say no to a bunch of orchestral work early in your career. And so as the parameters of the work that our players to produce changes, and we might want players who come from a far more diverse range of backgrounds and bring a more diverse range of perspectives to bear to their work. I think this is kind of a big problem that we have to solve, that actually at the top tier of the chamber musicians that are working in the UK, and I would imagine in Europe as well, actually we don't really see a diverse range of perspectives and backgrounds in those players. Tom, I'll hand over to you at this point. I'm really curious to hear what you think on that, and then we can maybe take some questions.
Yeah, of course. I have to admit, in your last sentence, I zoned out because I was reading Neil's question, which I really like. So I'd actually like to steer away from the question you asked me and go on to Neil's. So Neil asked in the chat about the higher music education, the role of the main subject teachers, their particular career experience playing a strong role in the education of the classical musicians of the future. From your experience, what would need to change? That's something that within the Philharmonia Orchestra, we deal with quite a lot, and we are trying to work more closely with conservatoires and those training facilities and higher education institutions. But sometimes a difficulty that we face is that our principal musicians are also the professors in those institutions, so that they have like a dual hat of having a Philharmonia identity and an academy or a Royal College identity. And that, for me, I think there needs to be a stronger connection. And I think we all want this. It's just capacity and ability to be able to do this at this particular time, that the ensembles and the conservatoires work more closely to understand what's needed at orchestral level and in the orchestral world. So within we have fellowship schemes for young musicians coming in, and we generally start that with this is the kind of work you might be engaged in, what kind of things have you looked at there? And their teachers are our principal players, and that they're taught about the technical precision of instruments, rather than going into community centres, going into domestic abuse refuges. And that's something that we as an orchestra feel is our role to do. And that's potentially not something that the conservatoires may need to do, because there are people within this data that say, like, I was being educated in a particular way in order to mean that I could kind of take the next step and learn the next thing after conservatoire. So I wonder if there's just more of a like a symbiotic relationship that should exist between conservatoires and orchestras. Do you think that made sense?
Yeah, I would also add to that that in a kind of a cultural ecology where the nature of the work is changing, I think it's at least worth kind of dipping our toes into this area that like the structure of the contracts that musicians are under at most of these orchestras is pretty incompatible with the nature of the job actually shifting. And
Completely
so
agree.
I think while the nature of an orchestral contract is that you win an audition when you're 21 and then they carry out in a box when you're 65, that is going to make it very, very difficult for actual practice and the delivery of work to sort of change through the career of a musician, especially if this kind of lifelong kind of top-up training isn't a really core element of the way that these orchestras operate. And so, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I sort of struggle to think, I mean, apart from academia, maybe any kind of sector where this kind of tenure is really awarded and you sort of, you know, stick around for such a long time. I mean, it just seems to be a very inefficient way to kind of run an organization.
Completely
Yeah,
agree.
Karen and I keep saying repeatedly that a lot of the difficulties that you can see in the classical music profession are very similar to university higher education life, particularly in this resistance to any kind of incentive to change. Change happens and it's gradually caught up with, but it's not very often really strongly directed by the people who are invested in that organisation.
I also add it is the contracts of the musicians, but it's also the articles of the charities and the organisations themselves that it's so difficult to steer a change in what a large institution that's been going for 75 years, such as the Philharmonia, is doing, that you come up against the fact that, well, actually, Article 7.1b says that we should be doing this particular thing. And it makes it very difficult to, in any way, move forward, because there's always more processes that you have to go through and more kind of historic arguing that has to happen.
But it was, in fact, a Maastricht question from my side, so thank you very much.
Adam, I was going to ask you if the situation is different for the collective, which you've set up to function in particular ways. You were kind of established to address some of these challenges, weren't you? So is the perspective different from the kind of slow moving of a 75-year-old institution that Tom's talking about there?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm very aware that it's very easy for us to say this stuff because we just like started the organization and we just did it the way that we thought it should be done, so we don't have that kind of institutional cultural baggage that, many of the sort of heavyweight, kind of symphonic institutions carry. But I do think that a really core part of this problem is that we have to be willing to kind of muscle up and kind of go into battle for these contracts and to change the nature of the job. Because on the one hand, I think if funders are creating imperatives that there's a certain kind of work that has to be delivered, then, we have to see that flow down to the actual, to the work that the musicians are getting engaged to deliver. I mean, we've written, contracts that are pretty bespoke for our organization. We pay higher rates in many, many areas than what the MU kind of standard is in the UK, but we also ask considerably more of the players. I mean, like streaming wasn't a thing, like YouTube wasn't a thing when these contracts were written. And so I think especially in a post-pandemic environment, we're finding that there are really clear and valuable pieces of artistic work that the players would be willing to do, but the management cannot get over the line because, you're not allowed to record more than 18.5 minutes of music in any one session or whatever it is. And so, suddenly the schools project or the broadcast or the film collaboration that you had planned is not viable. So we've had from Brandon Farnsworth, the speaker, who said tenure is also a protection against precarity. It's important to note, and I would agree with that. But I think at the moment, actually, things are so far weighted in the direction of tenure that I sort of think it's it's difficult to defend the system that is currently in place as the best way of getting the job done, especially in an environment where actually there's a massive oversupply when it comes to musicians. You know, conservatoires are graduating far, far more musicians than orchestras can ever accommodate. And so the idea that you'd like randomly award a bunch of them a job based on an audition, a process which I might add everyone knows is like rubbish for selecting the best player, you know, that just seems kind of insane that that's the system.
Great. There's lots of interesting discussion going on in the chat about the role of conservatoire teachers. And it's interesting to hear your perspective, Tom and Adam, that actually those are also the players. So the kind of dual role and the extent of power, therefore, that those people are wielding feels like it could be addressed from their teacher perspective, maybe more easily than from their player perspective. Encouraging them to think about their responsibilities to the next generation of players rather than the effect on their own kind of currently relatively secure careers.
I think that goes like the role of some professors in some conservatoires, that they see the concept of education being a very slim thing. Many others don't, and we've got quite a lot of those that work with us, so we're quite lucky. But some of those professors are often the ones that refuse to do the work and therefore refuse to see any of the change and take up those new skills. So there's another kind of complication in that system there. Adam, what are you thinking? You look like you've got a thought in your brain.
No, I'm just looking through the conservatoire comments in this thread, which is it's really kind of going off. I mean, I certainly think that again, I mean, it's the tenure issue is as much an issue when it comes to kind of instrumental teachers at the conservatoires as it is when it comes to membership orchestras. I guess ideally, you know, we aim for a situation where, you know, the individual lessons that are offered at a conservatoire are there to support, you know, small chamber projects, which are there to support larger orchestral projects, which are there to support, you know, kind of a larger ecosystem of kind of learning and education that will serve, you know, students really well through their careers. Sarah Price has just written in the chat, it's interesting the extent to which your whole degree can be bound up with one person and their ideas on what it means to be a musician. And yeah, I would really agree with that. I think, you know, I've spoken a bit at the college and the academy in London this year, and the graduating class of this pandemic year, you know, they're kind of losing their minds because on the one hand, they have teachers telling them about what, you know, kind of, you know, training they've delivered and the kind of career that they've had and what the music world is like. And then they know that they're graduating into a context which is sort of completely different and for which actually those skills are not going to serve them particularly well.
Thank you, Neil, for the fielding of questions that you're doing in the chat. I don't know how you're doing that, but it's great. And you've posted one here from Mark Tatlow about flexibility in the way that the music itself is thought about and presented, which is interesting to me. Karen, you might want to come on this. That from an audience point of view, it's all about that, isn't it? It's all about the format of the concert, the ways in which the music is coming across, whether the players are talking about it, how they're making it kind of human and connected. And that didn't come across so strongly in our data. Maybe we didn't ask the right questions, but we weren't getting a lot of feedback on the presentation of the music. The music, you know, was the core of what the players were doing, but they didn't seem enormously invested in kind of alternative presentation modes and things like that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I didn't read. I mean, I don't. That might come up in the interviews, I guess, as we dig into more of the specifics of what's going on. But I do think that there's none of that in the data. It's more about the kind of educational outreach type work or different places of work rather than the concert hall and what happens in that environment. I think in our data.
So it's kind of concerts and rather than something else instead. Yeah, which is I mean, all of this is such an important reminder to audience researchers that there is that whole additional perspective that often isn't noticed, I think. And so, this opportunity to kind of dig into it from both sides has been really useful. I think we are pretty much out of time. Any kind of final thoughts from everybody?
I would say on Neil's last comment from Mark, that there's something there both about the presentation, but also what is performed. And I know that's like an age-old question of what is being performed by the orchestras, but changing the aesthetic itself will then hopefully have an impact on the audiences and where it's presented and all of this kind of stuff. And because the musicians generally that we work with are trained to perform the certain pieces and to be able to sight read specifically well in certain ways, the ability to improvise, to create and write new music and collaborate with other art forms is something that we're working on at the moment to really try and help our musicians along with on that process, to be able to think in slightly different ways that will ultimately then change that presentation. And
Joachim, you've snuck in a final question there, and I think lifelong learning is absolutely the key here, isn't it? Relating back to that beautiful sort of poetic response from one player about feeling that your learning begins at graduation rather than ending there. I think as university teachers, Karen and I think all the time about equipping people to carry on learning rather than sending them out finished. And I think maybe that's the key to success in changing any industry, including the classical music profession. Karen, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, just only to say that I think that, what a musician's lifespan, the kinds of work that they can sustain changes, like any athlete. There comes a point when actually sustaining the long hours of rehearsal and everything becomes really difficult. And so one of the things about making a musician's career sustainable is keeping that open love of learning so that they can learn new skills, learn to use their skills in different ways that they can continue to train the next generation, and yet still feel like they're making a difference and making meaningful kind of contributions to the industry. So I think that lifelong learning is absolutely essential, actually, from an individual point of view, but for the sustainability of the industry.
Wonderful, thank you. That's a really nice place to stop. So I think we should finish there. I've no idea how we do that technically, but
I can do that by stopping the broadcast.
Fabulous, thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much on behalf of the Conservatory and of course MCICM. This was very a great presentation, very valuable to us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All the best.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.